Every 100 years, a woman identical in appearance to her predecessors appears in the village of Caxican. This woman, referred to as the village ancestor, lives precisely until her 100th birthday before passing away. The village ancestor holds a unique status in our village, and portraits of these women, dressed in period-specific clothing, are displayed in the main ancestral hall. The most recent portrait from the last 100 years is a 17-inch black and white photo of a young, beautiful girl with the typical bangs of that era, thick eyebrows, big eyes, and a clear gaze. On the day the old ancestor passed away, a baby girl named Chin Yen was born in the village, marking her as the new village ancestor. I am a year younger than Chin Yen, and I grew up hearing stories about the village ancestor, naturally admiring her. Chin Yen was different from other children. She was solitary, often sitting alone on the hilltop. While other children were afraid of her, I wasn't. I would follow her around, calling her sister, regardless of whether she responded. Being pretty, sweet, and clingy, I gradually grew close to Chin Yen. I discovered that beneath her cold exterior, she was gentle, caring for the plants and animals in the forest and looking out for me. I saw Chin Yen as my sister and never thought the title of village ancestor had any special meaning. Unlike others, I didn't keep my distance from her because of it. Our village was poor, with only one primary school, and the nearest middle school was several kilometers away in the town, requiring children to board there. Chin Yen was gentle, beautiful, and intelligent. I naturally assumed she would continue her studies through middle school like the rest of us. However, she dropped out after primary school. Hearing this, I asked her why she had stopped studying. She sat under the big jujube tree at the village entrance, her head bowed, with her hair covering half her face, making her seem gloomy. She coldly replied, "The town is too far, I can't go." "It's not that far, it's just 2 mountains," I retorted, dissatisfied with her answer. Suddenly, Chin Yen raised her eyes and stared at me deeply, her gaze so calm and unfathomable, like a lake with an unknown depth, instilling a sense of fear in me. Her stare left me speechless, with goosebumps running up my spine. After that, I found Chin Yen terrifying and had nightmares for a long time, where monsters took on her appearance and chased me. Each time I woke up from these nightmares, the memory of her gaze that day would make me shiver under the covers. From then on, like the other villagers, I kept my distance from Chin Yen. She seemed indifferent to this, continuing her life as usual, unaffected by anyone's presence or absence. My father was the most successful man in our village, having made a fortune selling fruits in the city. Thanks to him, I became the only person in our village to attend high school in the big city. My father threw a grand celebration, and to everyone's surprise, Chin Yen showed up. She usually never attended such gatherings, and her presence at any celebration was unheard of. My father felt honored and insisted I treat her warmly. I hadn't seen Chin Yen for a while, and she had grown to look more and more like the portraits in the ancestral hall. Seeing her suddenly gave me a strange sense of unease. Our relationship had become distant. I reluctantly invited her to sit, and she did so with such grace that I noticed her demeanor was unlike that of a typical village woman. She exuded an air of elegance, like an aristocratic lady from ancient times, and this thought sent a chill through me. I sat nervously with Chin Yen, wishing my father would come to rescue me from this awkward situation. My father, however, was being pestered by villagers to drink and had passed out after only 2 tables. Unable to wait for him, I sat with Chin Yen until she finally said she wanted to leave. Relieved, I was about to see her out when she suddenly bent down, her waterfall-like hair cascading down, momentarily blinding me. All I could see was her pale, bloodless face and her deep, gloomy eyes. Terrified, I almost jumped out of my seat, but she held me down with one hand, pinning me to the chair. Her mouth curved into a faint smile as she softly said, "Xiaomei, remember to come back." My spine went rigid, and I was too scared to move for a long time. That night, I sleepwalked. In my dream, Chin Yen was chasing me, saying she wanted to take me back to the village. I ran for my life. My father said that in the middle of the night, while everyone was asleep, I suddenly burst out the door and dashed outside. He thought a thief had broken in and, seeing my shadow running away, chased after me. My father's sleepiness vanished as he instinctively realized something was wrong. He quickly ran after me. In the pitch-black night, I ran faster than a rabbit. My father shouted after me, chasing me up the hill, where he helplessly watched me jump off the cliff. Seeing me jump, his legs went weak, and he fell to his knees. "Do you know how I crawled to the bottom of the hill, crying?" he asked, wiping his tears. Luckily, Anchin had just cleared some grass and piled it at the bottom. Otherwise, I'd have been collecting your body. I interrupted my father, urgently asking, "Did you see anyone else on your way to get my body?" He replied, "Not a soul, not even a ghost." Where would people come from? But I clearly remembered seeing Chen Yan. She fed me something when I was barely alive. A chilling fear crept through my bones. I couldn't be sure if I had really seen her since I was on the brink of death and likely not clear-headed. Maybe it was just a dream, but there were many things I couldn't understand. Why did I sleepwalk? I'd never had that problem before. Sleepwalking aside, why would I jump off a cliff? There was no evidence linking Chen Yan to the incident, but her presence was everywhere. If it weren't for her, I wouldn't have been scared into sleepwalking. The cliff I jumped from was where she loved to sit and daydream. After I jumped, she seemed to have appeared there. The more I thought about it, the more terrified I became, breaking out in a cold sweat. I developed a fear of both the village and Chen Yan. After being discharged from the hospital, I went straight to the city with my father. For the next 7 years, I never returned to the village. I finished high school in the city, got into college, and started dating a local boy. He had never been to the countryside. Sometimes, we would talk about our childhoods, and I would tell him many stories about my village. The joys of childhood are always unforgettable, even if my departure wasn't pleasant. Years later, I still recalled the happy times. My boyfriend was intrigued by village life, and I had a sudden idea: why not take him back during the summer to experience authentic rural life? When I mentioned the idea to my boyfriend, he readily agreed. After 7 years, as I set out for the village again, my excitement slowly turned into apprehension. My boyfriend noticed my sudden mood change and asked what was wrong. I thought for a moment and decided to give him a heads up. I haven't mentioned this before, but there's something strange about our village. My boyfriend became interested immediately. "Tell me more," he urged. I briefly mentioned the village ancestor, and his curiosity grew. He asked many questions, and I told him everything I knew. Oddly enough, while other villages had seen some development over the years, even if not prosperous, ours had remained unchanged, as if forgotten by the booming economy. My father drove us to the town in his second-hand truck, where we left the vehicle with a friend and hiked several kilometers, carrying our bags. Walking on the familiar muddy road, any tension or anxiety I had felt earlier melted away, replaced by a long-lost sense of joy. My grandparents were waiting under the big jujube tree at the village entrance. Seeing their stooped, white-haired figures brought tears to my eyes. Strangers rarely visited our village, so the villagers gathered at my grandparents' house out of curiosity. My boyfriend and I distributed the snacks and candies we had brought. Many of my childhood friends now had children, who lined up to call me auntie. After mingling with the villagers, my boyfriend urged me to take him to the main ancestral hall to see the legendary village ancestor portraits. I tried to dissuade him, explaining that the hall was usually locked and only opened during rituals by the village leader. My boyfriend wouldn't give up. "Let's just look at the door," he suggested. I realized then where horror movie characters who love to take risks come from. Art imitates life. On the way to the ancestral hall, we ran into Chen Yan. I had seen the village ancestor portraits and knew she was beautiful, but I had underestimated the impact of her beauty in real life. After years apart, Chinyen had grown into the exact likeness of the village ancestor: dark brows, black hair, almond-shaped eyes, and red lips. I had always considered myself attractive, but next to her, I felt utterly inadequate. My boyfriend stared at her, unable to look away. Chinyen wore that familiar faint smile, the one that had haunted my childhood nightmares. Instinctively, I wanted to hide behind my boyfriend, but seeing his captivated expression made me angry enough to forget my fear. Chinyen greeted me first. "You're back." I responded awkwardly. Her gaze shifted to my boyfriend, and I couldn't help but feel she looked at him a little too long. My boyfriend casually greeted her, and his behavior annoyed me. Even after she left, he kept staring after her. "Is she the village ancestor?" he asked. "What's her name again?" "Chinyen." "Nice name." When he finally turned back to me, seeing me glaring at him with my hands on my hips, he laughed and put his arm around my shoulder. "Let's go, let's see the portraits." I had assumed my boyfriend, having no experience with village life, would struggle for the first couple of days. To my surprise, he adapted better than I did, eating and sleeping well. In the height of summer, the plum trees were bearing fruit. I gave him a straw hat and planned to let him experience a day as a fruit farmer. The wild plum trees were tall, and as I happily used a stick to pick the fruit, a pale, bloodless face suddenly appeared among the swaying leaves, nearly causing me to fall from the tree. Unnoticed, Chinyen had appeared under the tree, her dark eyes devoid of warmth. Her gaze shifted from me to my boyfriend as she directly asked him, "Do you want to see the hilltop?" Xiaomei used to love playing there with me. My boyfriend eagerly jumped down from the tree. "Sure." With Chinyen leading the way and my boyfriend following, I trailed behind, angrily kicking stones along the path. I recalled the first time I met my boyfriend. I was wearing a new dress and walked past him. When he glanced at me, his previously calm eyes rippled with interest. He had fallen for me at first sight. People say love at first sight is unreliable. A man who falls for you at first sight can just as easily fall for someone else. Why couldn't that someone else be Chinyen? I followed them to the hilltop, which indeed had a beautiful view. From Chinyen's usual spot, the entire village was visible. At that moment, my boyfriend stood there, stretching and looking out happily. I had kicked stones all the way to the top and was angrily stomping one into the dirt when I heard my boyfriend say, "From this angle, the landscape below forms the character, urn." He said it nonchalantly, but Chinyen suddenly looked up. I wasn't in the mood to care about urns, but her reaction puzzled me, so I let the stone go and walked to the edge. Due to my fear from past experiences, I didn't dare get too close to the edge and look down from a distance. I couldn't see the character anywhere and scolded my boyfriend, "Nonsense." He chuckled and picked up a stick to draw the ancient character, urn, on the ground. It wasn't the simplified form but the traditional one. Both characters meant the same thing. I looked again, comparing the character he drew, and realized he was right. Our village, viewed from above, indeed formed the shape of an urn. "You're a science student, why learn so many obscure characters?" I asked. My boyfriend shamelessly replied, "You need to know a bit of everything. You never know when it might come in handy." "Isn't that right?" He directed the question at Chinyen. Chinyen seemed a bit startled and subconsciously nodded. Within 2 days, rumors spread throughout the village, even reaching my father. He sat at home with a pot of tea, waiting for me. When I emerged from my room after a nap, my father, visibly upset, asked, "Where's your boyfriend?" Groggy and confused, I didn't understand the situation. My father took a swig of tea and scolded me, "Sleep, sleep, all you do is sleep. Your man has run off with someone else, and you're still sleeping." If my father hadn't berated me, I wouldn't have known that every afternoon while I napped, my boyfriend and Chinyen were together. Villagers had seen them multiple times, and they didn't even try to hide it, seemingly wanting everyone to know. I felt humiliated. My father, unable to stand my distress, threatened to beat him. I stopped him, saying, "Don't worry about this. I'll handle my boyfriend myself." Before my boyfriend returned from Chinyen, I started packing my bags. It didn't take long since I didn't have much. As I finished, he walked in. I handed him my bags and said, "Let's go back to the city today." He sat down with the bags and calmly said, "I'm not leaving." I was furious. "What do you mean? Have you really fallen for her?" My tall boyfriend sat on the small stool, looking quite docile. He rested his elbow on his knee, holding his chin with one hand, and smiled at me. His demeanor annoyed me even more. "Get a grip. She might be pretty, but that doesn't mean you're a match." He nodded quickly, agreeing, "Yes, yes." "Then what do you mean? You're not seriously thinking of staying, are you?" He put the bags down, looked at me, and said seriously, "Yes." I was incredulous, raising my voice. "Did she put a spell on you?" My boyfriend scratched his head. "No, nothing like that. Don't overthink it." Though we hadn't been together long, I knew him well enough. He might seem unserious, but he was upright and principled, never messing around. This situation was completely off. I had brought him to the village, so I couldn't ignore the strange things happening to him. Summoning courage from who knows where, I decided to confront Chinyen alone. I went to her house first. Her mother said she had gone up the hill. Huffing and puffing, I climbed up and found Chinyen sitting at her usual spot, gazing at the scenery. I stood 2 meters behind her. Sensing my presence, she turned to look at me with calm, water-like eyes. I felt nervous, leaning against a large rock for support, and stammered, "You and my boyfriend, you too." Mentioning my boyfriend, I saw a visible change in Chinyen's eyes, a strange light of excitement deep within her dark pupils. I was almost certain she had intentions toward him. My question stuck in my throat, and I felt all my strength leave me. I almost begged, "Chinyen, please let him go." She tilted her head, stood up, and with a strange smile, began walking toward me. "Remember 7 years ago, Xiaomei?" she said as she walked. "That night you sleepwalked and jumped from here." Her advancing steps mirrored the scenes from my nightmares. Sweat beaded on my forehead, and I instinctively wanted to run, but the rock behind me dug into my back, and my legs felt like jelly. "Don't come any closer," I tried to shout. Blindly, I tried to stop her, but Chinyen calmly confessed, "I did that. I bewitched you to sleepwalk and jump off the cliff." My heart pounded with shock, feeling like it would leap out of my throat. So, it was her. Chinyen stepped slowly to stand before me, her lips forming the words, "I'm sorry." Paralyzed by fear, I was stunned for a moment. She continued in a detached tone, "I had to do it." I was completely dumbfounded. "What do you mean?" Chinyen didn't answer. She took my hand and led me to the edge. Terrified she might push me, I struggled with all my might, screaming, "Let go of me." Chinyen made a shushing gesture, saying, "Look." As if bewitched, I stopped. The mountain breeze blew, lifting a strand of her black hair. She let go of my hand and gazed into the distance, as she had done countless times before. Only then did I see the desolation in her eyes. "Do you see it?" she asked, pointing to the village below. "Do you see it? That's an urn." I didn't understand. Her familiar faint smile appeared. Hundreds of years ago, this was a general's territory. The feng shui here is unique. The general commissioned a large urn formation, and the people from the manor were forced to move here, becoming the first villagers. "What's an urn formation?" I asked. Chinyen's tone was icy. "It's a formation that steals fortune. Everyone born here has their fortune taken to nourish the formation's master and his descendants. It sounded like a fairy tale, impossible to believe. Chinyen continued, the villagers have their fortunes taken, leaving them poor and destitute. Few ever leave. Even if you leave, it doesn't mean you escape because your roots are here. My mind reeled, on the verge of collapsing. I stared at Chinyen, unable to react. She lowered her eyes and asked softly, do you know why a woman identical to the last is born every 100 years? I shook my head in shock. Chinyen's lips showed a trace of bitterness. The so-called village ancestor is the formation's eye. It's always been the same soul. I've been trapped here for generations, unable to reincarnate or leave the formation. I can't even go to the town beyond the 2 mountains. Finally, I understood why she had dropped out of school. She had been trapped in the village for centuries. Shocked, I felt a deep sympathy for her. Chinyen's expression was bleak, as if lamenting her fate. She spoke softly, you have great fortune. Even in this formation, you had the chance to leave. I was so happy when I learned you could leave. There was a hint of warmth in her eyes. Years ago, when I was a child playing by her side, she had looked at me with those same gentle eyes. But as time passed and too many things happened, she became more and more terrifying to me, and I hadn't seen that look since. My eyes welled up with tears. Chinyen seemed to recall the past, her voice lowering, I planted a mark on you. Since ancient times, dark arts have been condemned. The urn formation has remained hidden and undiscovered. I hoped the mark on you would signal someone outside, leading a skilled person to help. But my abilities were limited. I could only plant the mark on someone near death, so I had no choice but to make you jump, nearly killing you. The fragmented memories in my mind began to connect, clearing up past doubts. Secretly, she had harmed me. I should hate her, but I couldn't bring myself to do so. I sat in confused silence for a while until a thought struck me. The skilled person you mentioned, could it be my boyfriend? The world seemed so surreal. I hurried back home to find my boyfriend lounging in my grandpa's rocking chair. Seeing me, he cheerfully asked, "Did you sort things out?" I barely caught my breath. "Is everything she said true?" He smiled and nodded, "Of course." I stood dumbfounded once more, then angrily said, "So when you first saw me, it wasn't love at first sight. It was because you saw the mark on me?" He doubled over in laughter, and I started punching him. After letting me punch him a couple of times, he stopped laughing and said, "Don't be mad. Your destined partner isn't me. Besides, think about it. We act more like friends than a couple." I was still upset about being kept in the dark. "So who are you, really?" He stood up from the chair, smiling brightly, and solemnly said, "I am Jianyu, a disciple of Qi Mountain, known as Jianyuan. But you can just call me your boyfriend." I scoffed, "Keep dreaming." Chinyen and Jianyu continued wandering around the village daily, and sometimes I joined them. Our harmonious trio became quite a spectacle in the village. My father now shook his head whenever he saw me, asking thrice a day if we should return to the city. I put all my effort into dealing with my father. A few days passed, and one afternoon, as I was about to nap, Jianyu and Chinyen walked in one after the other. My heart sank, I had a vague sense of what was coming. Chinyen looked at me quietly, a faint smile on her lips. "We've known each other for so long. Won't you come to see me off?" Holding back tears, I slowly climbed the hill. The two ahead didn't consider my feelings, climbing quickly. In less than 10 minutes, we reached the top. Chinyen stood at the edge, taking one last look at the familiar scenery, her smile as gentle as a spring breeze. My eyes were already red from crying. Chinyen turned to me, her gaze soft. I couldn't hold back any longer and rushed to hug her tightly, sobbing, "Chinyen, I forgive you. I'm not mad at you anymore. Chinyan gently patted my head, whispering in my ear, "Thank you, Xiaomei." Tears streamed down my face as she wiped them away. "You should be happy for me. I've waited 500 years for this day. I'm finally free. If there's a next life, I hope we meet again." Sobbing, I nodded, "We'll still be sisters. I'll take you to eat delicious food, travel, and visit many places. We won't stay in the mountains anymore." Chinyan's eyes were full of longing as she replied, "Okay." She then bowed deeply to Jiangyu in a manner only seen in ancient times. "Jinyuan Taoist, please assist me." Jiangyu nodded, and Chinyan smiled, spreading her arms like a bird about to take flight. Jiangyu pulled me behind him. A talisman appeared in his hand, and he began chanting. I felt a sudden breeze through the forest. His voice thundered, "Great Law Bell, urgent suppression, disperse." The talisman shot out like a sword, producing a dull crack as something shattered. My mind buzzed as if electrified, and I felt something silently and continuously flowing into me. The sensation was fleeting yet profound. When I regained my senses, Chinyan's body had turned translucent, gradually disappearing before my eyes, her face showing a peaceful, liberated smile. The formations I was broken, and the spell destroyed. I accompanied Jiangyu as we roamed the village, moving boulders, digging up roots, redirecting springs, and altering feng shui, tasks Chinyan and he had painstakingly uncovered. They intended to thoroughly dismantle the formation, leaving no chance for its resurgence. The first day, I mourned Chinyan's departure. The second day, I was moved by their efforts. The third day, I diligently worked alongside Jiangyu, hoping for Chinyan's happiness in her next life. On the fourth, fifth, and sixth days, I noticed that the villagers who had been wondering about the village ancestor suddenly stopped. The portraits in the ancestral hall became blurred, and I could barely recall details about Chinyan. I asked Jiangyu, "Will we all forget her?" He nodded, "Forgetting is good." Panicking, I ran to my room and wrote in my notebook, "Remember to take Chinyan on a trip. No mountain villages." Back in the city, my life became hectic. My graduate exam results came in, and I got into my desired school. A project I entered in a competition won first prize, and I was scheduled for a TV interview and a school lecture. That year, the government supported rural economic development, appointing my father to liaise with fruit wholesalers. He led the villagers in planting orchards, transforming our once poor village into a prosperous community. Everyone's lives improved, and each household had new hopes. Jiangyu and I broke up but remained good friends. Every time I saw him, I felt like I had forgotten something. Whenever I doubted, he'd smile and say, "Don't worry. If you forget, I'll remind you." Satisfied with his reassurance, I stopped worrying. Despite his playful demeanor, Jiangyu was quite reliable. The end.